B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, March 24th, 2020. I want to dedicate this podcast to a member of my extended family, Brian. He is on life support in an intensive care unit using a ventilator. He's tested positive for the coronavirus, and he is clinging to life right now in Detroit. Yesterday, I caught a brief mention on the PBS NewsHour. It cited a comment and produced a little soundbite from the Secretary General of the United Nations, whose name is Guterres. And today, I did an online Google search, and I entered UN worldwide ceasefire. And what PBS had reported, and it appears to be the only outlet in the United States that has done so, is that the Secretary General has called for a worldwide ceasefire, a pause in hostilities, in order to, in a humanitarian way, deal with the pandemic. And the only thing that I could find online is from a British, what appears to be a British news source, which is called Newstrack Live. And they gave it pretty short shrift. Here's the action paragraph. He called to immediately declare global ceasefire in every corner of the world. It is being said that during the online briefing at the United Nations, Guterres said the whole world is facing a common enemy, COVID-19. And despite this, armed forces around the world are busy in war. He said that's why he is calling on the world today to immediately declare a global ceasefire in every corner of the world. Now the time has come to lock down military conflicts and focus together for the real battle to protect our lives. Now, there's one more paragraph that doesn't really add much to that point. And I am stunned, because I think that what the Secretary General has articulated is really important. The American public doesn't even know he said it. The viewership of the NewsHour is a couple of million a night. But I didn't find anything about it from the New York Times, the Washington Post, or any other video news outlet. And I'm outraged, because I believe this is a message that needs to be heard and acted on. We should park all military operations for the duration, and gosh, it might even lead to an outbreak of peace. Imagine that. Powerful piece from Sarah Lazar, published, I think, a couple of days ago at the In These Times website. And she raises important concerns about the growing calls for bringing in the military to deal with the coronavirus crisis. She cites Mayor de Blasio of New York. He's calling for a military response. I want their medical teams, which are first rate. I want their logistical support, their ability to get stuff from factories all over the country where they're needed most. The only force that can do it in America effectively and quickly, he says, is the United States military. And she notes the irony that the next day was the 17th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And in Lazar's voice, we are seeing calls to turn to the U.S. military and National Guard to fill the gaps. The desperation driving this trend is understandable, but we must not uncritically turn to military institutions as providers of medical teams and logistical support without looking at how the U.S. military itself is a purveyor of unconscionable violence, from its 2003 invasion of Iraq to its worsening of the present-day global pandemic, or how it could be used to crack down on people within the United States. So this past Sunday, Trump gave orders to activate the National Guard in New York, California, and Washington State into federalized status, which means that the feds will pick up the cost. But the troops remain under the control of states. Military Times reports that all 50 states, in addition, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and Washington, D.C., have each mobilized components of their Army and Air National Guard to assist in response to the pandemic. And she notes, while the Guard is a domestic force, it can be mobilized in times of war and national emergency, falling under the control of the Department of Defense. She cites Newsweek. The U.S. military is preparing forces to assume a larger role in the coronavirus response, including the controversial mission of quelling civil disturbances and enforcing the law. Then she talks about Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, using the crisis to sidestep legislative oversight, shut down his trial for corruption, and enact sweeping security measures, including the use of cell phone data to track people. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban is using the crisis, and he has asked the legislature to allow him to rule by decree. Lazar says, when we fortify the military, we also reinforce the larger imperial apparatus it is part of. The Trump administration is acting on behalf of the imperial apparatus to tighten U.S. sanctions on Iran in the midst of this global pandemic, despite warnings they're cutting off needed medical supplies and increasing coronavirus deaths. Iran is one of the countries hardest hit. Why isn't ending these sanctions just 2.5 months after we assassinated the General Soleimani and almost drew Iran into direct war considered a top priority in the fight against the virus? She continues, U.S. military aid is enabling Israel's 14-year economic and military siege of Gaza, one of the most densely populated places in the world, where we now have 2 officially confirmed cases. Gaza has 2 million people and 62 ventilators. In Venezuela, 42 confirmed cases of the virus. U.S. sanctions have helped push the country's medical system to ruin and are estimated to have already killed 40,000 people just from 2017 to 2018. And she says it's no mystery what's going to happen to the people living in these places if the U.S. doesn't act immediately to relieve the tremendous harm it is causing. So I would call for a worldwide ceasefire and a suspension of sanctions, particularly against hard-hit countries. Later, Lazar writes, the U.S. military is not a public health organization. It is a purveyor of wars, occupation, and proxy battles with 800 military bases around the world. We have every reason to think it would be a ferocious force policing the streets of the United States, prone to punitive responses, at a time people desperately need food and rent money. When the National Guard was deployed to New Orleans, and I will add there were military contractors from Blackwater on the streets of the Big Easy as well, after Hurricane Katrina, it took on a largely punitive law enforcement role. So I have linked to her article and also the brief article that brought us the news about the UN Secretary General's call. They're in the show file for today's podcast. And I'm very pleased to tell you that I'm back in the interview game. I took a little time off because the coronavirus and the other issues of my life had limited my ability to conduct the interviews. And the first one I'm bringing you this week is Dr. Justin A. Frank, the Washington, D.C. psychiatrist who is the author of Trump on the Couch, and before that, Obama and Bush on the Couch. And I spent a lot of time talking about the concept of narcissistic supply, which I learned from my friend Ford Green, and we discussed that quite a bit. And here's a comment from Dr. Frank that describes the desperate needs of Donald Trump for attention and adulation. And because he can't hold his mob rallies, the White House press briefings that extend to as long as 2 hours appear to be his source currently of narcissistic supply. Here's Dr. Frank.
At a deep level, I don't know how far to delve in here, but I will try. At a deep level, when a person's narcissistic supply is inadequate, the person feels empty and hollow. Then the person feels anxious about needing an audience and needing a supplier. So he gets annoyed and angry and envies the very people. It's like biting the hand that feeds him. He envies the very people who give him what he needs because he realizes at some level he can't live without them. So what he's done is projected or evacuated his need into the audience. But when there is no audience, the next move for a person like that is to become paranoid because they put their neediness and they feel humiliated by having so much need, and they feel ashamed and weak and that they're going to be attacked for having these needs. So they misperceive their experiences. His experience was that Peter Alexander was attacking him because Trump became paranoid. He was unable to hear the praise or the need for him to say something positive, because by then, if a narcissistic person is not getting his supplies, which by then it was clear that he wasn't, no rallies, he couldn't even leave to play golf. If he's not getting his supplies, underneath narcissism lies paranoid anxiety. And in fact, the deepest levels here are that even grandiosity is a compensatory feeling to compensate for paranoid anxiety about need, about vulnerability, and about hating the people who can give him something that he can't give himself.
That's Dr. Justin A. Frank, psychiatrist and author of Trump on the Couch. The full interview will be posted later today for my subscribers at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And I'll remind you, if you're not a subscriber, for just $1, you can take out a 24-hour pass and hear this interview right away. As you know, these interviews, my in-depth interviews, are behind the paywall for 14 days, and then that expires and the access is unlimited. Now, I've told you in recent podcasts that the State of Israel revealed that it has a complete data collection on the cell phones of people who live in the State of Israel. That Netanyahu revealed this in an effort to try to declare his state of emergency, and I'm sure that there is a reasonable response to coronavirus in the moves that Netanyahu has made. But just like Trump, he includes his own opportunistic needs, like keeping his pal in charge of the Knesset so that they don't replace him with somebody from the Blue and White Party. The court has now intervened and ordered the leader of the Knesset to step down and the new election to be held. This is likely to lead to a lifting of the immunity that has been partially in place for Netanyahu on his corruption cases, and it could lead to the formation of a new government without Bibi. Now, if you think this isn't happening in the United States, the Washington Post reports it today. If you have a smartphone, you're probably contributing to a massive coronavirus surveillance system, and it's revealing where Americans have and haven't been practicing social distancing. A company called Unicast that collects and analyzes phone GPS location data, usually for commercial clients, has launched a social distancing scoreboard that grades county by county which residents are changing behavior at the urging of health officials. It uses the reduction in the total distance we travel as a rough index for whether we're staying put at home. And while every time I have a chance, I decline to provide location information, even to Google Maps or to Waze or any of those services, I know that my phone knows where I am. Because when I leave the secret studio today, it's going to have a secret conversation with my car. And it's going to announce to me that it takes 18 minutes to get home and traffic is light. Now, while you can say, oh, isn't that handy? Isn't that great data to have? Well, it's not private data. Unicast's location data comes from games, shopping, and utility apps that tens of millions of Americans have installed on their phones, information the company normally analyzes for retailers, real estate firms, and marketers. And maybe you've seen on Rachel Maddow's nightly show, she has been accessing data from a company that has smart thermometers. And the thermometers, tied to an app in your phone, report the data of your location, and they can map how many people have fevers in a certain area. And it's fascinating information. It's not personalized, right? Or is it? And, of course, it's this slippery slope. While it may be helpful to track movements, to track temperatures of Americans at this time, once that genie's out of the bottle, once that toothpaste is out of the tube, we're screwed. In South Korea, they have an app to track tens of thousands of quarantined people whose phone would alert authorities if they left home. Google collects and shares where we go. Google Maps has included a live read of how busy popular destinations are based on location data. Facebook, it's Instagram, lets you see other people who've recently shared updates from locations. Both tools are useful to anyone who wants to practice social distancing, and it's also useful for tracking our every move. Now, one of the things I haven't seen any coverage on in recent days is the use of the Stingray device. These are the boxes that simulate a cell phone tower, require phones to check in and dump all their information. And it's supposed to be secret. But some of us know too much. So these are serious risks that we're facing. And I'll just briefly mention that I recently updated the Firefox browser on my desktop computer, and it offered me the option to click on a box and create a Facebook container, which they say will prevent Facebook from tracking you around the web. The Facebook container extension for Firefox helps you take control and isolate your web activity from Facebook. All right. What's Firefox doing with my data? I'm sorry to be so specious, but that is my state of mind. Now, this one is totally outrageous, off the charts. And it comes from Texas. Dan Patrick is the right-wing Republican lieutenant governor. And he was over there on the friendly Fox News channel yesterday. And he said that he's not only ready for the country and the economy to get going again amid the pandemic, but that he and other grandparents might be willing to die for that to happen. He told that little mother, Tucker Carlson, my message is, let's get back to work. Let's get back to living. Let's be smart about it. And those of us who are 70 plus will take care of ourselves, but don't sacrifice the country. I'm not living in fear. I'm living in fear of what's happening in this country. And you know, Tucker, no one reached out to me and said, as a senior citizen, are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all our America loves for your children and grandchildren? And Patrick said, if that's the exchange, I'm all in. And the New York Times cites an unnamed tweeter. Not one single human being deserves to die for somebody else's stock portfolio. And on television, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo mocked the idea, well, we'll just sacrifice old people. They're old people anyway, and the old get left behind. What is this, some modern Darwinian theory of natural selection? You can't keep up, so the band's going to leave you behind? No American is going to say accelerate the economy at the cost of human life, because no American is going to say how much a life is worth. And that is a response to Trump's call, based again on a suggestion from a Fox News host, that he wants to kind of ignore the pandemic, the efforts to keep it from spreading and spiking, to overwhelm our medical capabilities. And today on a Fox News town hall, he said that he hopes to get things going again by Easter, which is just a couple of weeks away. And as we know, after all of the effort to persuade him to take this seriously, and the somber comments that he has presented in recent days, reading from scripted talking points about how serious he is in defeating this. Of course, we know he cannot be trusted to tell the truth. And here's more crisis opportunism. Texas and Ohio have included abortions among the non-essential surgeries and medical procedures that they say should be delayed until the pandemic passes. These decisions are all being made by men, and most of them are white guys. And to see them use this opportunity to force women to give birth, if they don't want to, if they can't afford it, if they think their child might be born with defects, or if they know that. This is so odious. And I like the terminology preferred by my old buddy Scott Dick in Monterey, that these people are not pro-life, they are pro-birth. And they don't care what happens to that child once it sees the light of day. Abortion rights activists say that abortions should be counted as essential and that they are correct. People cannot wait until the pandemic is over. Health authorities in Ohio last week issued a similar order. It's prompted a legal scramble by abortion rights groups to preserve access. And in both Texas and Ohio, those who provide access to abortion are determined to continue, but they're being threatened with fines of up to $1,000 a day or 180 days of jail time. And it just shows that when we get into a mode like this, and it's fair to say it happens with both political parties, they take advantage of policies that are being imposed, of bills that are being passed, to add on gratuitous matters like this. Here's today's COVID-19 news summary, prepared by Linda Lewis, and I'm grateful to her for putting in the work every day. The CDC reports we have a total number of identified coronavirus cases in the U.S., 44,000. 544 people have died so far. About 20% of the people on the planet have been told to stay home to stop the spread of COVID-19, which has infected about 400,000 people globally and killed more than 17,000 human beings. In India, the Prime Minister has announced a nationwide ban on coming out of your homes for 21 days. The Tokyo Olympics have been postponed. The United Kingdom has gone into a full lockdown with the British public ordered to stay at home for up to 6 months. So when you see other countries respond this way, Trump's premature call to lift these protections is criminal. It's deadly. And it shows that he doesn't give a damn about the humans who might be sickened or die. The economy, the almighty dollar, is clearly more important to him. And as I mentioned, Trump told the Fox News town hall today he wants the country back open by April 12th. That's Easter. I don't know if he thinks that he's going to roll away the stone and everything's going to be fine, or the Easter bunny's going to magically fix everything. And maybe he'll back off. He's an impulsive guy, and perhaps saner minds will persuade him of the idiocy that he is embracing. And Trump offers these bromides like the U.S. wasn't built to be shut down. We cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. Well, his standards are highly suspect, and we know they revolve around money. He wants to get his hotels back open after he takes bailout money from the federal government when he signs a bill that will benefit him and his cronies the most. Trump announced he signed an executive order to ban the hoarding of crucial medical supplies and equipment, including face masks, hand sanitizers, and personal protective equipment. And he said that he wants to prevent price gouging, but didn't enumerate any steps to move in that direction. We've talked frequently about the availability of a presidential authority under the Defense Production Act, where he can order industries to deliver ventilators, face masks, what have you. And it appears that he did actually sign an executive order last week invoking the law, but he didn't use it right away. And apparently he does plan to use it for the first time to mandate the production of 60,000 coronavirus test kits. And here's a question I have that I haven't seen addressed anywhere, and that is, if, I go to a testing center, all they're going to do is take one of these really long Q-tips and stick it up my nose, maybe in the back of my throat, to get a culture. Then they put the culture in a tube. Then they send it to the lab. Now, maybe the lab can't create its own test kits, but the collection of my specimen, I don't understand why it requires a single test kit or a dedicated test kit that has my name on it from the very first moment that the swab is stuck into my orifices. So if you happen to know about that or you've seen a reliable source, feel free to send it to me, peter@peterbcollins.com. The Federal Reserve, St. Louis Bank President James Bullard, he's blurting out some truths that you wouldn't hear from the White House press briefings. He is afraid that U.S. unemployment could reach 30% in the second quarter, triggering or linked to a 50% reduction in gross domestic product. Those are very serious numbers. Now, in a bit, we'll get to an update on the efforts in the United States Senate. I checked just before I sat down behind the microphone. There has not been a vote. There is some debate. There is some progress. That's what we're told. Meanwhile, there was a bizarre Cuomo and Cuomo interview on CNN last night. You probably know Andrew, the older brother, is governor of New York, and Chris, sometimes derisively referred to as Fredo, because he's the little brother. That's an Italian slur, according to Fredo. Chris is an anchor on CNN. So he brought his brother, the governor, on. And while the exchange was valuable and, Chris did ask some tough questions of his brother, the governor, Andrew continued to pepper him with snarky and snide comments that show a serious sibling rivalry, even as adults. And I think those guys should keep that off the TV screen. At any rate, Cuomo has said that the state projects it may need as many as 140,000 hospital beds to handle the peak load, up from 110,000 predicted just a few days ago. As of now, only 53,000 are available. Up to another 40,000 intensive care beds may be needed. Then there's the ventilator problem. In a veiled comment aimed at Trump, he said, "You want a pat on the back for sending 400 ventilators? What are we going to do with 400 ventilators when we need 30,000? You're missing the magnitude of the problem, and the problem is defined by the magnitude." And by the way, in my interview with Dr. Justin Frank, we talk about Andrew Cuomo, how jealous Trump is of him, and how Trump apparently is watching many of Cuomo's news conferences. And it gets him all fired up, so he has to trash tweet at Cuomo, who has been trying to avoid conflict and appear to, hope to develop better relations with the White House. And here's a comment from Linda Lewis. As I mentioned, she is editing our daily summary here. She writes, "Until today, Republicans avoided using the Defense Production Act to turn out more tests, masks, and gloves, critically needed supplies that would enable a faster return to normal and save more lives, alleging that the situation wasn't dire enough. but it was for some Republicans to call for the sacrifice of millions of Americans on the altar of Wall Street. For one thing, Patrick's proposal, that's the lieutenant governor in Texas, threatens many more lives than those of seniors. It also affects institutionalized people, people of all ages with certain disabilities or chronic illness, and younger people, especially men in the prime of their earning years. Many more people will be hospitalized, surviving, but with impaired health and massive medical costs. Even those sacrifices wouldn't do much to improve the economy. Countries that implemented drastic measures and halted the spread of the virus aren't going to be eager to do business with a country where the virus is still rampant. And Cuomo also noted that the numbers of cases in the state of New York is doubling at the rate of every 2 to 3 days. So we have not reached peak infection, and predictions are that it's going to come on like a hurricane here in the very near future. Now, because of the extreme measures taken in China, some of which, I'm very uncomfortable with, they basically just locked people up and, used the police and the full power of the state to enforce quarantine on 60 million people. Well, in the province of Hubei, which is where Wuhan is the provincial capital, they have permitted about 60 million residents, or they're saying most of the 60 million, to leave their homes and presumably at some point starting back to work. But in Wuhan, they are announcing that it will remain sealed off until April 8th, although public transportation will start running again before April 8th. And this is described as the latest sign that China appears to have successfully tamed the epidemic. And they had 3 or 4 days where they reported no new cases, and there was one new case reported as a local infection, saying that a doctor had tested positive in the last 24 hours or so. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And there are a lot of great folks out there, and I won't name names, but one of my staunch supporters emailed me last night with apologies, saying that he is conserving his cash because he doesn't know when his next paycheck will come. And so he has suspended payments, and if you need to do that, don't hesitate. What I will tell you is that I am not suspending subscriptions, even if you decide that it's not in your best interest to make the payment. It's one of the few things I have power over in this topsy-turvy world today, and there are many generous people who they overpay for subscriptions with the intention of subsidizing people who can't afford one in the first place or, in today's climate, need to conserve their cash. So please, keep listening, and don't feel at all guilty if you need to take a step like that. With that said, let me thank Mary Vaught, Janet Price, Joey Perillo, and Paul Tomaselli, people who have current subscriptions to this podcast. And if you're in a position to take one out and help offset those who can't pay right now, feel free to stop by peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and you can choose a level of support that's comfortable for you, $5, $10, or $20 a month. And if you don't like PayPal, you can correspond with me at my P.O. Box, number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, it does appear that the Democrats, by holding out for the last 2 days, have forced concessions from the Republicans in the Senate and from the White House. There do appear to be some additions to the bill that will create an inspector general to monitor how the bailout funds are spent. The amount in the slush fund to be controlled by Secretary of Treasury Steve Mnuchin, the foreclosure king, has been scaled back. I think he has about $45 billion in party cash instead of the $500 billion that was in the Republican bill. And after all his hissy fits yesterday on the Senate floor, blaming Democrats left and right, well, left and central, Mitch McConnell said, today the Senate can get back on track. Today we can make all of the Washington drama fade away. If we act today, what Americans will remember, what history will record, is that the Senate did the right thing. But is it the right thing to dump money into cruise ship companies? After all, most of them are American-based, but they cheat on taxes and they cheat on the registration requirements of the federal government by flagging their ships offshore. The most common is Monrovia, Liberia. Many are flagged in countries with very little oversight of cruise ships. And so they act for their own interest and convenience. Why should we be just shoveling money at them? And the same with the airlines. They squandered the cash from the profits they made and from the tax cuts they got by buying back stock to make the executives richer. And as I said yesterday, the proper route for them is the bankruptcy process. And then we might consider a bailout. So what I understand is the amount of money for the airlines is roughly $32 billion in what are called grants. Why don't we just, dispense with the euphemisms? These are gifts coupled with $32 billion in loans, and we don't know the terms of the loan agreements. But, of course, the Fed brought interest rates to almost zero, so that this is seen as free money at the government perspective. And will they charge the airlines or make the interest payment a gift as well? So even some Republicans like Dan Sullivan of Alaska in the Senate said that he supports more transparency. Joe Manchin, the barely Democrat from West Virginia, who had a big shouting match with McConnell on the floor yesterday, he said, we got better oversight, better oversight. The oversight basically is saying that, you can't just exempt everybody and give all your corporate executives based on the backs of the taxpayers free carnival. All right, Joe. Turning the page here, Schumer and Mnuchin stayed late into the night negotiating, and Trump tweeted a warning to Republicans aimed at killing some of the provisions promoted by Nancy Pelosi in a bill that was drafted by the House but will not be brought to the floor. Pelosi has said she simply wants to adopt the Senate bill by unanimous consent. Part of the problem is the House is not actively in session right now, and not all of the members are available to vote. And, of course, the legislators like it because a unanimous consent does not require a list of the yeas and the nays, as they say in the language of the Senate and the Congress. And that way you can't use it against them if things go sideways. Want to recommend a piece at Who, What, Why today by Larry Beinhart, and he details some of the commentary I mentioned yesterday about how much this parallels the way the Secretary of the Treasury in 2008, Hank Paulson, joined up with the Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke and shook down Congress on a Thursday or a Friday, saying unless you act, the financial system of this country won't be active on Monday. And everybody bent over, dished up the cash, and, of course, the bankers took advantage of it every way they could. Good editorial voice of the New York Times for a change, clearly blaming Mitch McConnell for the stall of this legislation by trying to jam a Republican-written bill revealed to the members with short notice through the Senate. Quote, responsibility for the deadlock rests squarely on McConnell's shoulders. The Federal Reserve unveiled a new set of needed programs to support the economy yesterday morning, expanding its whatever-it-takes crisis response. The operational independence of the central bank is once again proving its value, but Congress must resist the inclination to treat the Fed's actions as an alternative to fiscal policy. And one of the things I'll note is that this is purely a bailout bill. Chump change for average citizens. The amount of direct payments to Americans has been reduced to $250 billion. But Boeing is going to get everything it asks for. The airlines, they'll get it. And the one element that I think is fair is that the Republican language would let small businesses borrow up to $10 million, and the loans would be forgiven for any business that avoided cuts in jobs or wages. But there are different rules for big business. Recipients of government bailouts would be required to avoid job or wage cuts only, quote, to the extent practicable, which is a meaningless limitation. The bill would create a $500 billion bailout for corporations, most of that to backstop the Treasury. And on Sunday, while I was napping and Trump was rambling, he said that he would not pledge. Well, here's the language. Trump refused to pledge that he would refrain from taking any federal aid for the Trump Organization and its hotels. I mean, he should have had to put the whole shebang in a blind trust at minimum or sold it off before he could take office. And he's gotten away with so much in terms of violating the emoluments clause and just brazen corruption that he's not embarrassed to say, sure, I'll take the money. I got deep pockets. Elizabeth Warren gave an interview to NPR and kind of set the terms for her objections to the Republican bill. She said you can't just take $450 billion, hand it over to the Secretary of Treasury, and say, hand it out to your closest friends on a no-strings-attached basis. There have to be strings. The taxpayer has the right to know if the Trump administration wants to hand that money out to a giant corporation, then by golly, we have a right to know that money's going to help workers, not to increase executive compensation or boost returns to shareholders. And she said, as it stands now, the bill has no meaningful requirement that companies maintain payroll or benefits for their employees, no serious restrictions on buybacks, no requirements to reduce executive pay, and no ongoing oversight. In fact, as you read this, it sounds like Trump hotel properties like Mar-a-Lago could receive huge bags of cash and then fire their workers if Steve Mnuchin decides he wants to do a real solid for his boss using taxpayer dollars. Now, the opportunism is not limited to Republicans. I want to credit Camille Salve, or is it Salve, who earlier this morning sent me a link to an article at Forbes magazine. Forbes calls itself, the financial tool, corporate tool. They're proud to state they're a corporate tool. Well, first let me tell you that the language I'm about to describe has been dropped from the bill that was being prepared in the House. And it was a plan to introduce a new digital currency and to use the payouts to individuals under this stimulus package, bailout package, with a digital wallet and digital dollars. And this comes out of Maxine Waters' Financial Services Committee. I've never heard of it. And it is essentially a Bitcoin operation controlled by the federal government. Now, as a way to pass out cash, I'd prefer a debit card or a gift card or some other form, because it is fair to say that there are millions of Americans who don't have a bank account or who no longer have a bank account. But keep in mind that this digital wallet would allow the government to know how much money you have, how you spend it. And I think that is a frightening prospect of big brotherism. So, again, from what I understand, it's been dropped from the bill, but it is a troubling proposal to begin with. I want to thank my niece Irene, who is a graduate student at the University of Chicago, for linking me up to an article at the Financial Times under the byline of Yuval Noah Harari. And he talks about the world after coronavirus. And his concerns, like mine, relate to the imposition of new processes, including surveillance, for the crisis period that will be with us permanently, if not for a really, really long time. He writes, if we're not careful, the epidemic might nevertheless mark an important watershed in the history of surveillance, not only because it might normalize the deployment of mass surveillance tools in countries that have so far rejected them, but even more so because it signifies a dramatic transition from over-the-skin to under-the-skin surveillance. Previously, he said, when your finger touched the screen of your smartphone and clicked on a link, the government wanted to know what exactly your finger was clicking on. But with the coronavirus, the focus of interest shifts. Now the government wants to know the temperature of your finger and the blood pressure under its skin. He continues, one of the problems we face is that none of us know exactly how we are being surveilled and what the coming years might bring. Surveillance technology is developing at breakneck speed, and what seemed science fiction 10 years ago, today is old news. He says the downside is that this would give legitimacy to a terrifying new surveillance system. If you know, for example, that I clicked on a Fox News link rather than a CNN link, it can teach you something about my political views and perhaps even my personality. But if you can monitor what happens to my body temperature, blood pressure, and heart rate as I watch that video clip, you can learn what makes me laugh, makes me cry, and makes me really, really angry. And as we know, that kind of information that Facebook and other social media sites have been collecting can be used against us. So I think this is a really important piece. I've linked to it in the show file. The Financial Times, which usually has a paywall, has lowered it for coronavirus reports. And you might get a little glitch when you click on it for their cookies check. But I was able to read it and print it out without any problem. Now, here is where Trump's mania and his personal psychosis is so dangerous. Because in his effort to con Americans, to give us blue sky, that this coronavirus isn't so bad, and their magic pills that are going to be available very soon, well, one of the drugs that he's talked about is a compound of chloroquine. And some people in Arizona, a Phoenix area man and his wife, took a drug, or they took a pill, and it was a different compound, chloroquine phosphate. It's an additive used to clean aquariums. And part of it, the chloroquine part, is also found in the anti-malarial medication that Trump has said is a possible treatment for COVID-19. And Dr. Fauci immediately said, well, this hasn't been tested. We've got to do that first. So the man has died. His wife is in critical condition. They went to the hospital about a half an hour after they popped the pills. And the woman, who's not yet identified, said, well, Trump kept saying it was basically pretty much a cure. And now her advice is, after losing her husband, don't take anything. Don't believe anything. Don't believe anything that the president says and his people. Call your doctor. Now, I'm afraid, and we discussed this in my interview with Dr. Frank, that too many Trump cultists can't even hear that. When they see one of their own take the president's advice and the man dies. And Dr. Frank says that the psychological imprinting that Trump loyalists have is very difficult to break. So the difference between the fish tank cleaning additive that the couple took and the drug used to treat malaria is the way that they're formulated. And there we are. Now, here's a fascinating update. Yesterday, I pointed out that Gilead Sciences the profiteering company that gets 60 or 80 grand a year for a course of drugs to fight hepatitis C, they have the exclusive patent on remdesivir. This is the anti-malarial drug that was tested on Ebola patients, but not in clinical trials. And get this, remdesivir was developed with $79 million of federal money. But Gilead exclusively owns the patent. They also have friends in high places. Joe Grogan, who has been recruited by Crown Prince Jared to serve on the White House Coronavirus Task Force. He was a lobbyist for Gilead for 6 years on issues including the pricing of pharmaceuticals. And so suddenly, the government has declared, I think it's the FDA, that remdesivir qualifies under the Orphan Drug Act, which is for a rare disease, and this is about as an extreme opposite of a rare disease you can possibly dream up, said a critic. They're talking about potentially half the population of the United States. It's absurd that this would happen in the middle of an epidemic when everything is in short supply. And the Orphan Drug Act essentially is an inducement to pharmaceutical companies to make products that may not be profitable by essentially preventing them from being used on the generic marketplace. So this could severely limit the supply of remdesivir by granting Gilead exclusive protection over the drug and complete control of its price. Another opportunity for massive profiteering by Gilead. And this is profiteering. This is it's not quite insider trading, but it's cronyism, where a White House can give this special status to a drug that Gilead, as I say, developed with $79 million of your taxpayer money. It's disgusting, if not worse. And now we see doctors. In many states, the list includes Idaho, Kentucky, Ohio, Nevada, Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Texas. They are writing prescriptions for friends and family for these drugs that have not been proven to be useful in treating the coronavirus that's currently out there. And what's going on here is they're writing prescriptions for Plaquenil, which is a form of chloroquine, and it's used to treat malaria, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, HIV, and other conditions. And I heard from one user, I'll protect her identity, but she takes this drug to treat her rheumatoid arthritis, and already the inventories are coming up short for the people who have been using the drug and relying on it for very important treatment. Finally today, I got a note from northern Italy at Lake Como, our friend Jerry Frazia. Peter, I know it's outside the range of responsible debate, but we in Italy are grateful for Cuba sending us 800 doctors. And now the British are grateful for Cuba letting a British cruise ship loaded with COVID-19 infected passengers to dock in Havana after being denied permission to land in several other countries, including the good old great United States of America. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast all the way to the bitter end here. Feel free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube for your convenience. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.